The subject we have today is about pay to print, how media corruption undermines Indian democracy. The Indian media, let it be said straight out, are politically free. The Indian media are politically free but imprisoned by profit. That is the state of the Indian media. But let me try and tell you that whatever is happening in the media is not distinct or divorced from the other processes at the top end of Indian society. I don't know if the Indians sitting in the audience follow my favorite website, which is Forbes.com. Especially the section called ForbesBillionaires.com. Have you seen? It's very interesting, by the way, Raka, that for women's studies and all that you should know, that Forbes brings out its list of billionaires every year on March 8th. There are very few women in the list, but for some reason they seem to honor International Women's Day. Well, anyway, the latest list, March 8th, 2011, shows us that we now have 55 Indian billionaires. Thank you very much. There are only 2 or 3 countries above us. I believe, though we are ranked 4th, I believe we are actually the 2nd. No need for guessing who the 800-pound gorilla on the list is. That, of course, is the United States, with some 400 billionaires. Then there's Russia and China, whom I shall deal with briefly. And then India with 55. China, of course, are a bunch of poseurs. Their billionaires are double ours in number, but less than half our net asset worth. They're in the little league. They're not worth more than 2 billion apiece on average. Ours is 4.5 billion. It used to be 6.5 billion in 2008 until those jerks in Wall Street blew it for everybody. So here we have $55 billionaires. Since I last visited Berkeley, the Indian government has set up 3 commissions. They will set up more on the subject of rural poverty. The reports have come out. Now you may ask why a government sets up multiple committees on the same subject. Actually, there's a very simple answer, and I think it's very reasonable. The government of India can sometimes put up 12 commissions on the same subject until somebody produces the report they want. Now, I was on one of these 3 commissions for my sins. It's called the BPL Expert Group, and we had some scintillating expert discussions on poverty, including one where 17 of us in an air-conditioned room in the Rural Development Ministry spent hours battling, 17 guys, all male, all upper class, 95% upper caste, debated heatedly for 3 hours on whether women were poor. You'll be happy to know that we sort of decided that you are. And it took a stout resistance on the part of 3 of us, including the poor chairman of the commission, N.C. Saxena, to hammer this point home. The first of these commissions was already out. I'm sorry, that was the National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, headed by Arjun Sen-Gupta. All the right credentials: IMF, World Bank, Planning Commission. So he was expected to give them a safe and decent report, instead of which he handed them a bomb, which on the first page says 836 million Indians live on less than 50 cents a day. Now that wasn't nice. So they immediately appointed us as a committee, 17 of us. And they did appoint a woman, but she didn't show up. I wonder why. But anyway, so the second committee, the BPL expert group, brought down that figure, which means that the biggest annexure to the BPL expert group is my note of dissent, but still placed it at above 50%. Now this was completely unacceptable to the government of India, And they'd had it with these large commissions of 15 members and 17 members. So they set up a one-member committee. I mean, basically, Dr. Suresh Tendulkar was in charge. And he had some assistants and stuff, but he was the decision maker. And he decided that the poverty level was 42% in rural. But what's important is that his figure was still about 12% higher than the government of India's figure. So 3 officially constituted committees, all of them essentially told the government, revise your poverty figures upwards sharply. Now, if you can't get a report saying otherwise from Suresh Tendulkar, you haven't a hope. Right. So, but you have $55 billionaires. The latest Global Hunger Index put out by IFPRI, Institute for Food Policy Research in DC, Washington, ranks India in a descending scale 67th out of 84 of the world's hungriest nations. We are below all South Asian countries except, I think, Nepal. And incidentally, child malnourishment in India is significantly higher, and that's a Government of India figure, than Sub-Saharan Africa, where it ranges between 30 to 35% in the Sub-Saharan countries. In the National Family Health Survey of India, it's 46%. Nearly half the Indian child population is malnourished. So it's also a country where the worst agrarian crisis since I spoke last time on the crisis, and I said that we were closing in on 200,000 farmers' suicides. The figure is now around close to 250,000. By the way, each hour that in every hour at the same time in this country, where all this is going on, the poverty figures need to be revised upwards. The Government of India writes off $12 million every single hour in corporate taxes, excise and customs duty. Every single hour. We're talking about dollars, $12 million. Or $100 billion annually in the latest budget. Budget 2011-12. Food, but none of these are really of issues of any concern in the media. Now let me begin. I'm going to primarily talk about a scandal that rocked the media from 2009. No, not the radio tapes. It's called paid news. In 2009, as the state of Maharashtra, population 100, Western India, and went to the assembly polls in October 2009. When the elections were declared around August or so, one of the largest newspaper channel groups, there are no cross-ownership restrictions in India in the media, one of the largest groups called its editors, print editors only, to Pune, now known as Pune, but known worldwide more familiarly as Pune. And when the 9 or so editors attended that meeting, they found that the bright boys of the finance department were also present at the editorial meeting. And the financial whiz kids raised this question to the editors. Tell us, how much does it cost to win one seat in the legislature? What is the cost? What does a candidate have to spend to win one seat in the legislature? And by the way, how many seats are there? So the editors said there are 288 seats in the Maharashtra legislature, and made a calculation on the back of an envelope, which calculation I think was entirely wrong. It shows how, they pondered long about the calculation, and editors are very ponderous people. So they calculated that it cost between $750,000 and $1.1 million to win one of those 288 seats. Okay. Actually, if you want a figure from people who are more connected with the electoral process and actually cover it in the field, Maharashtra, it costs the average expenditure of the winning candidate is between $2.2 million and $3.5 million. Now, why is this important? It's important because the per capita income of the state is $1,250, which tells you how concentrated wealth is. The per capita income of Maharashtra is $1,250. Mumbai, which is the richest part of Maharashtra and which raises the entire per capita income, its per capita income is $2,800. Okay? But to win a seat, the minimum you're going to spend is $2.2 to $3.5 million, which rules out such a gigantic section of the population. Anyway, the editors explained that you needed to win 145 seats, which means an expenditure of about 160 million. The winning candidates would have had to spend. The editors didn't go with my figure. The management didn't go with my numbers. I wasn't consulted. They asked their editors. They went with the low-end figure of 1.1 million. 1.1 million, 145 winning candidates is 160 million US dollars. And they gave their editors and sent out an email to their branches giving them a simple instruction. We have to get 30% of that. What's an election? It's a campaign. What are we? We're a newspaper, we're a television station, we're an online agency. 30% is what we've got to get. So, which meant that they had to get, at least about 50 to 60 million out of that. Then, they were very generous and lenient about losing candidates. They said, losing candidates don't pay their bills. So they said that losing candidates, if you get a recovery of 10 to 15%, okay, but try for 20. The sad part is that they succeeded and exceeded their target by several $1 million, showing you the extent and role of money power in Indian elections. They exceeded their target. This group alone made between 80 to $100 million. We don't know exactly how much, but they made an incredible amount. Mind you, they were irritated. The main rival of this group, Lokmat, made even more. So, in this state of Maharashtra, a few $100 million were made on an assembly election by the media. Totally, if you took the national election of 2009, when we first broke the story, the stories on paid news were a series running in the Hindu, which I broke and wrote. If you take the top 20 corporate media groups, then we're talking about something not far removed from the vicinity of $1 billion in a national election. So we're talking real money here. We're talking about hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars if you take 28 states and 6 union territories. But the heaviest spending is in about 8 or 10 states like Maharashtra, Andhra Pradesh, Tamil Nadu, these sort of places. So what happens in 2009 and 2010 is that the media earn hundreds of millions of US dollars, equivalent, in Indian terms it's a few thousand crores. One, violating election expenditure limits. You know what the election expenditure limit is? Now all these editors are sitting around discussing what the expenditure, minimum expenditure to win a seat in Maharashtra is. The election expenditure limit in Maharashtra is 23,000 US dollars. Okay, and for a parliament seat, it is 56,000 US dollars. And everybody openly talks about the minimum being $1.2 to $3.5 million expenditure. They only another outcome of the exposure is that they have doubled the election expenditure limits. But even after doubling them, these guys are about 50 times over the limit. The second violation is that of the democratic electoral process itself, which is devastating because, sad to say, in Mumbai, for instance, most of the candidates riding on what you call paid news. That is, propaganda of the candidate presented as news, not as advertising, and with no indication that it is puff material. Most of these candidates won. They may have anyway, but they won. Third, it distorted seriously electoral outcomes in numerous constituencies across the country, and devastatingly so in Maharashtra. Fourth, it violates the process of institutionalizing paid news, violated every conceivable canon and media ethic that you could, write down, and some which you couldn't. 5, it violated audience trust in the media by selling them propaganda and advertising material and lies, wholesale lies, as news. And 6, it undermined democracy itself, as this has become a very big issue outside the media. The main media cannot talk about it because they're involved, but it's been, every major institution in the country has had a take on this. The judiciary are now coming into it, the Press Council of India, the Election Commission of India, Parliament. The Vice President chose the 50th anniversary of the Election Commission of India to say that this Vice President of India is Hamid Ansari. He said, the paid news is a double jeopardy for democracy. 1, it undermines the basis of a fair and free and balanced press. 2, it devastates the electoral democracy of which we are so proud. When we talk about Indian democracy, its strongest point has always been electoral democracy and the ability of people to change their governments, and quite often. So this was the process. A lot of what I'm saying today is centered around a scandal like that paid news scandal. There are those, I'm sure, who expect me to say a word, so I will say a word about the Radia tapes, another scandal that placed the media in a very poor light. The Radia tapes are a much more important scandal in another way, in that they showed us who was running the country. The corporate world, a handful of CEOs were having discussions on who should be in the cabinet, who should not. Who in the cabinet should get which portfolio and who should be divested of that portfolio. Now all these conversations got taped because somebody was tapping, the income tax was tapping leading corporate lobbyists' telephones. In the process, we had 40 very edifying conversations released so far of journalists, 40 journalists and multiple conversations, where the journalists come out as, they really come out bad. They come out as stenographers to power. They come out as errand boys and errand girls asking the corporate, one guy is asking the lobbyist, what kind of article would you like me to write on this? And he's been the editor-in-chief of the second or third largest newspaper in the country. Okay, so the media have not come out looking good, and this was the Radia tapes. You can ask me about it later, more in questions if you like. Today we are on the pay to print, because it's all part of the same process of corporatization. The media are, I'm coming to that. I'm trying to locate this whole exercise in the context of, I should say that just in case that, we have any bouts of self-righteousness here, I trace the origins of paid news as a concept and as a philosophy to our role model in just about everything. United States. We'll come back to that also. Yeah? I hope we will. It's a long thing. I'm trying to place this in the following context. 1, the rapidly growing corporatization of the media in ownership, content, and culture. There are newspapers that are not corporate owned, but which are fully in the corporate culture. That's one thing. Second, the hyper-commercialization of the media in the reforms period. Obviously, liberalization, privatization, and globalization were needed to pave the way for that pace of commercialization and corporatization, including the opening of the floodgates of foreign direct investment in the media. In the electronic media, there is no limit at all. In the print media, there are nominal limits like 26% or 42%, whatever they made it. It's a joke because you set up front companies and then still a foreign owner can. Murdoch owns a lot of television in India. And the third thing that is important here in the context, the emergence of the media not only as incredibly powerful political players, but as large enterprises whose rates of profit are the envy of the remaining corporate sector. The media in India are not collapsing. The only whereas each time I visit, I find that your guys are further down the tube. The only thing that I haven't found reduced in the US media is their arrogance. Otherwise, they've really shriveled. There is also the process of the extension of the media, what were media companies and ownership, into just about every imaginable sector of industry and commerce. Okay? From large media companies are big players in fields ranging from agriculture to aviation, from sugar to stock markets, from finance to fashion, from event management to mining. And for the rest of it, it's very hard to tell the difference these days between fourth estate and real estate. Plus, there is the extremely complex interlocking directorships and interlocking ownerships that see many, many top corporate leaders sitting on the boards of media. The short point is this: the media are not pro-corporate, the media are not pro-business, the media are not pro-establishment. They are the establishment. They're the cutting-edge ideological arm of it. They are large corporations and they are very big business. To show you how big that business is, we have a section where, okay, let me tell you, in 36 months, the investment in the Indian media was 124 billion rupees. Okay, I have a conversion somewhere which I'll tell you. And that includes the highest investment in the meltdown year of 2008. More than a third of that, nearly 40% of that comes in the meltdown year. But back to paid news in this context. The Press Council defines paid news. Yeah, we now have definitions for it. Defines paid news as any news or writing appearing in a media, print or electronic, for a price in cash or kind, in consideration. Translated into simpler stuff, that is propaganda, ad puffs, and content that is commercially driven is presented to unsuspecting audiences as news. In other words, paid news is news for sale. One of the latest sting operations done in India is a sting operation done by the Sunday Telegraph. You can go up and Google it. It happened only in February or March. The Media Net organization of the Times of India, the Sunday Telegraph, having read all these stories, conducted a conversation with them and was able to purchase all kinds of space from them. And the paper offered that, for front page, for this position, your event must have celebrities. However, it so happens that we have some celebrities also for hire. So, yeah. It's actually, you can look it up. It's only in February, March. It's essentially news for sale. Why does this appeal to the political classes? By the way, this was not something the political classes initiated. Many of the stories I wrote came on complaints from leading politicians who felt that it was media extortion, or you'd be blacked out of the coverage. You'd simply be blanked out of the coverage. The first of the stories came on a complaint from a union minister and a former journalist. He was particularly offended that they'd asked him, because after all he'd been part of the profession, he expected a discount. But anyway, the first story was based on his complaint to me that this was getting out of hand. There is a charm, though, to the political class for paid news because it allows them to break and breach poll expenditure limits. It's cash transaction. It's completely illegal. So you can breach the poll expenditure limits. Second, it allows them to outspend their rivals by millions of dollars and win an election. Third, it presents poll propaganda to audiences as news. Fourth, the politician is also currying favor with the country's most powerful media groups, who will then support him or her when they are in power. And five, there's a fringe benefit. You pay a little extra, we trash your opponent. Now, the world champ in this was the former Chief Minister of Maharashtra, Ashok Chavan, who's since lost his job for a relatively minor scandal, called Adarsh, which became a very big media issue. One of the lovely things, if I may point out to the Indians some cause for joy, is that all our worst scams have the nicest names. Adarsh, which means ideal. The biggest corporate scam was called Satyam, which means truth. And there was the Commonwealth Games, right? Entirely private profit, but yeah. So Mr. Ashok Chavan got so excited by his capacity to spend and purchase, and you're looking at the costs here, in the 4th largest newspaper in the country, a Marathi newspaper called Lokmat, Mr. Ashok Chavan got 156 pages, full pages of news, most of them in color, not projected as advertisements. The newspaper has 13 editions, and each of them had 12 pages on him. And the cumulative print order at that time of the newspaper was in excess of 1.5 million. 1.5 million was the print order of that newspaper. Now, by the way, 1.5 million pages, the cost of the newsprint would keep a lot of journalists employed for a while. The cost of the newsprint would breach the election expenditure limit several times over. Yeah, he did it. Now, I am Mr. Chavan's favorite journalist, and as I always followed him closely, and I got hold of his expenditure account. You'll be delighted to know some of the entries in the expenditure account. He organized a meeting of Salman Khan, the Bollywood biggest audience drawing star of Bollywood. Now think that suppose you organize a rally of George Clooney, Tom Cruise, and 5 others thrown in. He organized the Salman Khan rally in the modest sum of $80. I'm not kidding, okay? The expenditure, the shamiana, the tent cost about $6. Okay? And the entry on advertising, his expenditure on advertising was $150. Okay? And by the way, on these 156 pages, there is not a single ad, whereas there are ads on all the other pages of that newspaper. Incidentally, then after I broke the story, it went to the Election Commission. The Election Commission sent notices to these newspapers. The Times of India and Lokmat and other newspapers sent in replies saying, this is news. We believe Ashok Chavan ji to be one of the most dynamic leaders ever to have approached on the horizon of Maharashtra. This is 2 months before he is sacked for a corruption scandal. And now he had been Chief Minister for all of 11 months. Now, I recall being here in 2008 in Berkeley and covering your election. I could not remember anybody giving the first African American president 5 pages. Okay? But 156 pages for the dynamic 11-month Chief Minister Ashok Chavan. Now from the media point of view, but there is a very positive side to this. When we did the first story, we had no names. We couldn't, because that minister was too scared. He won't go on. He gave me the material. One of the pieces of material that the minister gave me, television channels were distributing rate cards for coverage, paid coverage. They're lovely. The rate card, they didn't put the logos on it, but they wrote their names. The rate cards are simply a work of art. The rate card says, standard profile, 4 lakhs, that's 400,000 rupees. Okay, that's about $10,000. Then there is special profile. For half-hour bulletin, it goes up to about 1 million rupees. My favorite was dawn to dusk coverage. A TV crew would follow you from AM to PM and, record for posterity your every... It's hard on posterity, but anyway. From the media point of view, there were several greater advantages than for the politicians. One, it evaded income tax. There's a reason they had a huge crisis in 2008 with the meltdown and needed to get out of that mess. So first, it worked brilliantly because it was large-scale evasion of income tax. All transactions are in cash, so they got their money and it went into the old oak chest under the proprietor's bed. Thirdly, it helped them forge deadly links with the future rulers of the country, or present and future in this case. Third, unions of journalists, and I'm proud to say two things happened. Unions of journalists, the Delhi Union of Journalists, the AP, Andhra Pradesh Union of Journalists, started tracking it and came up, after the first 5 stories, came up with astonishing figures of what was being spent in paid news. But the most positive part is, after we published the first story without names, and I'm so pleased to see some of my old students in the audience who are journalists, many young journalists across Maharashtra, to be exact, 24 of them, sent in material from their own newspapers saying, Sainath ji, this is our paid news, we're marking out the portions for you, they were risking their jobs and lives because most of them did not know me personally. They just did it on blind trust. Okay? I received 24 courier packets from different parts of the state, from people who lose their jobs and will never find another if their names were revealed. And that's how we came up with the explosive story with all names, and we decided in the Hindu that we would name and shame and face the legal consequences, whatever happened. There were about 3 months of muttering about legal consequences, but nobody went anywhere near a court. The only thing that happened in the meantime was that there were 32 kilograms of paid news. My wife has come to hate paid news because it occupies a lot of her living room. But there were 32 kilograms of newsprint all over the place. Then when we were trying to figure out, I got a half a dozen young journalists came. I can't read Marathi. So they were reading it aloud and telling me what it said. 6 guys going on, my head spinning. Then I said very irritably to one of them, you've read that damn story before. He said, yes, but this is from another newspaper. Then we found exclusive stories in 6 different newspapers under different bylines on the same guy. Word for word in 3 newspapers. Maharashtra Times, belonging to India's biggest media group, highest revenue media group. Pudari, a very large Marathi newspaper in Maharashtra, and Lokmat, 4th largest newspaper in the country. The bureau chief's byline, the political chief's byline, and exactly word for word, every single item. So that's where the story broke, on paid news. And what it became funnier as we went on and dug in. Some papers were principled and took it as ads. Some papers took it as news. So the same identical item appeared in ads as an ad in one newspaper and as front page news in another. My favorite was the one of the Nagpur Southwest candidate who appeared as an ad on the front page of as an ad on the front page of Express, but as a news item on the front page of Hitwada, biggest English paper in central India, and the headline was, "It is wrong to mislead the people." Anyway, the paid news has a history, a structural history, and I am arguing today that the media have a structural compulsion to lie. They have to. They have no option. You'll see why. In 2002, the Times of India, always the pioneer in every racket that goes on, the Times of India is owned by, it's an old British company which then was taken over by Indians. It used to be called and is still called Bennett, Coleman and Co. Limited. More affectionately known amongst journalists of my generation as Bandit, Conman and Co. But anyway, in 2002, the Times of India launched a new thing called private treaties. You want to take down that website name, it's Times of India privatetreaties.com. They're not hiding this. Paid news, they deny that they had anything to do with it. But it's interesting that in 2 years that the paid news debate has been going on, they haven't carried one item on it. They don't allow you to mention the word. However, the private treaties are a matter of pride for them. What private treaty sounds like an agreement between two nations, doesn't it? It's an agreement between a newspaper and a corporation that we will promote your interests. Now, what is the agreement? Follow me closely. It learns from the American way, but does it differently. We are innovative people. And so what happens here is that your company is a medium level retailer of whatever, and you need to break into the big league. You feel quite rightly that what you lack is serious marketing. So you come to the world's biggest English newspaper. A lot of people don't understand the size of Indian media. If you made a list of the 15 largest English newspapers in the world, 3, maybe 5 Indian newspapers would figure. The largest English newspaper in the world is the Times of India, by far. Anyway, so he is a medium level retailer wanting to break into the big league. You know the first part of the agreement, the first key part of the agreement, when he signs a treaty with me, I get 10% of his shares. So I become a part owner of his company and have a vested interest in promoting it. Okay? That's the first part of the private treaty. Second part of the private treaty is that he will pay, I will pay him for his shares. We're very principled here. I pay him for his shares against advertising space in my newspaper, on which, remember, I'm paying income tax. The income tax guys are going to say a full page in the Times of India is worth 50 million rupees, so you bloody well pay up. So I'm going to get 10% of the shares in his company. What then happens is that I cannot allow my reporters, this won't be written, but it means that I cannot ever criticize or do negative coverage of that company, because I am part owner. I own 10% of it. I'd have to be an idiot to undermine him. The classic example for the Indians who are, or those familiar with India, how many of you have heard of pantaloons? Yeah. Did you know that before 2000, pantaloons was unheard of? In 2002, pantaloons, a small level garment trouser retailer, signed a private treaty with Times of India. How am I telling you all this with total disregard to legal consequences? Because they're so proud of it, they take out a half-page ad in December last year to tell you how we made pantaloons. So Pantaloons signed this agreement, and in 5 years, Pantaloons is the largest retailer of men's trousers in India, and surely in the Indian subcontinent, on the basis of numbers. Okay? So it was a successful marriage, the private treaty. Now, imagine when a newspaper has 200 such treaties. The question arises whether then you remain a newspaper or you become an equity firm. Yeah, seriously. If you've got shares in 100 companies, let alone 200, you've got shares in 50 companies, everything you cover is going to be colored, the coverage is going to be colored by your ownership in those companies. Many of the reporters at the Times of India, poor lambs, are my students. No one can remember the list of things you're not supposed to cover, or the list of things you're not supposed to criticize, and they frequently thereby get into trouble. Now comes, really, when you come back to it, it's Wall Street that really buggers up everything. Right? So here we are having our nice little private treaty orgy. And you run screaming off a cliff in 2008 in Wall Street, September. Now suddenly, these millions of shares that I'm holding are not worth the paper they're printed on. Right? Suddenly those shares are worth nothing. That's where paid news steps in a big way. Paid news, believe me, existed. It existed in a small way. And don't confuse paid news with journalist corruption. Individual journalists, I take $5,000 from you and manage to sneak in your profile. That's individual corruption. What the media here were doing was an industry of extortion and corruption. This is an industry worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The decisions are not taken by individual journalists. As one journalist working in the major newspaper that did this racket rang up and told me, he said, when you and I joined journalism 30 years ago, we had a choice. When it was all individual corruption, we had a choice to be corrupt or not to be corrupt. When the maliks, when the owners are running the racket, what choice do we have? And when they tell you that your byline will go on this interview with Ashok Chavan or whoever it is, because we need a senior name on it. Now what do you do if you've got 2 kids in college, an ailing mother, and a family to support? Right? So the 2008 collapse brought everything tumbling down. The value of the shares. Suddenly paid news came in, no taxes. Now remember the other problem. The shares collapsed, the value of the shares collapsed, but the income tax still wanted their 30% per page. Yeah? They're very hard to dissuade. So it's one of the universal features of every country in the world. So you are paying taxes on money that you were losing. That's how paid news came in a very, very big way. But here is the lie. Now the newspaper companies, which are part of much larger companies in some cases, had to create this unbelievable euphoria over the Indian economy. Economy zooms back, smoking. Now the authors of that headline were smoking something, I don't know what the substance was, but it was clearly ecstasy or euphoria, or whatever the going name for such substances is. Two large newspapers including, then advised their desks, you will not use the word recession in relation to India. Recession happens in the United States. In India, we are experiencing, and they got a quote from a learned economist in one of their, to India we are experiencing a slowdown. We were zipping along at 95, now we're going at 90. Okay, so you will refer to the Indian economy as an economic slowdown. You will not use the word recession. The R word was banned and went out. Now why did they have to lie? Why did they have to do this? Because they had to heat the stock market and push their shares back to value. Here's my short point. The media are too heavily invested in the market to ever tell you the truth about it. That is the structural compulsion to lie. Okay? Now you've got millions of shares. If it tanks, you drown. By the way, your media companies are even more heavily locked into the market. Okay? Yeah. I mean, you want to look at NBC, its previous owner, General Electric, its present owner, Comcast. It's what Ben Begdikian, who used to be the dean of the journalism school here, dean and professor emeritus also. Ben Begdikian described the such interlocking in the US media as corporate incest within corporate incest. You'll find it in his brilliant book, remains the best ever written on the media in the last 30 years, The Media Monopoly. Published by a press called Deacon Press Boston, owned by the Unitarianists, Unitarian Universalists. Because major media will find it very hard to stomach publication of that book. So you have a structural compulsion to lie. In election terms, when it comes to elections, this is bad enough in commerce. But first you're telling the public huge lies about the economy. The same newspaper groups which were talking about the economy zooming back, in our count, sacked more than 3,500 journalists, cameramen, technicians and editors in the same period that the economy was zooming back. By the way, your publishing industry lost 35,000 jobs. Does your media tell you much about this? You know where I got this 35,000 figure from? One of the Association of Journalists, I think colored journalists or whatever, did it, and it was published in the journal Editor and Publisher, a 108-year-old journal. The irony of it was that Editor and Publisher went bust the next issue and also shut down. I think it's online. I don't think it has a print edition anymore. So the paid news helped the media come back to profitability. It created such havoc that the Securities Exchange Board of India, which is the high priest of corporatism, has put out all sorts of rules against private treaties, which the papers are ignoring completely after observing it for one day. And mind you, SEBI has SEBI, as we call it, has mandatory legal powers, but even then, they are so powerful and so arrogant that they can afford to tell SEBI to go jump. The Election Commission of India has introduced an entirely new division to deal with paid news. And with a Director General, who, by the way, is not an official of the bureaucrat of the Election Commission or ECI. He is one of the top 5 tax commissioners in the country, because they figured out that this is a tax racket. You know, I mean, they must have read up on their Al Capone. So, Parliament sets up a commission, and the government sets up, immediately on anything that happens, the government of India sets up a GOM, group of ministers. And the group of ministers included Mr. Sharad Pawar, whose family owns Sakal, which is one of the largest Marathi groups, newspaper groups and television channels in the country, and has a very interesting history in paid news. The Press Council of India brought out a devastating 72-page report on paid news done by my friend Paranjoy Guha Takutta and Srinivas Reddy of Inaugural, both members of the Press Council. They did a devastating expose of paid news, and then the owners pulled the plug on the Press Council. The Press Council suppressed its own report and put out a 12-page summary without any names. Whereas everybody in the 72, by the way, of course, immediately what we did was to put up the 72-page report. It's available to you. You can see the 72-page report, you can read the 12-page report, you can have fun with it. But to this day, the Press Council of India has not put it on its website. They say we thank the authors and we will be using it as archival material. Right? In the last 18 months, the Times has not mentioned the word paid news or anything of the sort. One item on Ashok Chavan, because of the story I did, he landed up in the Election Commission. He challenged with one of India's biggest lawyers how to challenge the jurisdiction of the Election Commission. The Commission has asserted its jurisdiction. Right. Now, who are the companies? Who are the owners? Who are the people? As I said, in 36 months, we saw an investment of $2.8 billion. 125 billion is $2.8 billion. Almost tripled in 6 months. We're talking about gigantic companies of incredible profit-making capabilities. Some of these companies are in internet, they're in newspapers, they're in print, they're in magazines, they're in broadcasting, they're in films, okay, like Inadu or Sakar. If you look at the top 20 Indian media companies and just look at their boards, the boards include head of Dainik Jagran, the largest newspaper in India, by far the largest. The board of Dainik Jagran includes the head of South Asia McDonald's. It includes a guy from GE, I think, from Raytheon. These are guys who are going to preside over the destiny of Hindi journalism. That's the board. I mean, we don't have the time, but I'm telling you, all the boards are similar. You can float it and you can look at it. There are the heads of multinational banks. There are the heads of top realty firms, the top 5 realty firms in India. Real estate is India's biggest racket. And there are large politicians who own gigantic media empires. In the Tamil Nadu state, which is going to election now, the chief minister and the leader of the opposition both own media empires. The Election Commission is scratching its head about how do you define paid news here. It's his channel. It's his newspaper. 60% of media share in that state. We have many Berlusconis. Okay? Italy has to make do with one. By the way, the Lokmat, which also got something else for its services rendered when it did 156 pages of news for Mr. Chavan. Lokmat's owner, one of the 3 owners, Mr. Darda, one owner, Vijay Darda, is a member of parliament. His elder brother was a minister of state. After he ensured the victory of the Congress in this, he has become minister of cabinet rank. So it worked out well, nicely for everybody. Now, if you look at the companies, the sectors that we are involved in, It's so commercialized. Just take, I find that 32 media companies have an interest in sugar. Okay? In fertilizer, in sugar. We don't have the time. But what does it do? It also influences what media covers. What are the beats of the media? Very quickly, in the country which has the largest number of absolute poor, the hungriest population in the world, there is not a single full-time correspondent covering poverty or hunger. Not one. There is not a single labor correspondent in a country whose employment exchanges list as many people as there are in the population of South Africa. There is not a single agriculture correspondent full-time. I'm the closest that you get to it, but I cover other things. The same newspapers have multiple correspondents to cover fashion, glamour, gossip, design. And in the Lakme Fashion Week of 2000, when six journalists were covering the Vidarbha farmers' suicides, the largest wave of human suicides in recorded history, 512 accredited journalists were covering the Lakme Fashion Week in Mumbai, 1 hour's flight away, and both were very closely connected because the Lakme Fashion Week, the theme of the Lakme Fashion Week was cotton garments. 1 hour's flight away, those who grew the cotton were killing themselves. I mean, this is the picture of the media in this. In short, in sum, we're talking about a media where you see a growing disconnect between mass media and mass reality. A gigantic corporate enterprise in the making with significant links into both politics, state and regional level political structures and commercial enterprises. A media that bases that one of whose characteristics is a structural shutout of the poor. When you don't have an agriculture correspondent and when you do not have a labor correspondent, you are saying that 75% of the population do not make news and we don't want to talk to you. That's what you're saying when you don't have a correspondent on these beats. A structural shutout of the poor, the corporate hijack of first the media's agenda and then of the media itself. The media also have now emerged, have long been and now emerged clearly as the most exclusionist institution of Indian democracy. You can see that in the caste and gender representation, especially in caste, in terms of where you can get if you're a Dalit or a tribal, and so-called untouchable or a tribal. Fundamentally, the moral universe of the media has shifted. The media also now function, as I said, not as pro-business or pro-corporate, but they are the establishment, they're the ideological arm of the corporate establishment. And that is the Indian media with its structural compulsion to lie, a media that are politically free, imprisoned by profit. Thank you very much.
Okay, so we have about 15 minutes or so for questions. So, yes.
Some good news.
I gave you several. I said that the young journalists exposed the paid news scandal. It shows you that it's still a profession that draws people driven by idealism, not by commerce. Many of those young journalists, and by the way, several old journalists also, like the guy who rang me up, he said, when he said about choices over individual corruption, he said that tomorrow you're going to see paid news in my newspaper and you're going to see my byline on it. I assure you I didn't take a single penny. What choice do I have? You know what happened in those 25 years, which made one of the changes? When he and I joined, as he pointed out, we were governed by the Working Journalists Act. We had unions that mattered. We had collective bargaining power. I still do, because I work for the only newspaper that still respects the wage board and the employees union. There are 2 or 3 in the whole country that do that, in English too. He works for a newspaper where he's been reduced to an 11-month contract. As he put it to me, from the 8th month you're worrying about renewal. You've got kids in college or school, you've got parents in hospital. Right? He was still leaking me material. And so there's plenty of good news. And the good news is that they took such a bath when they tried doing that in 2008, with the private treaties. The good news is that it's out in the open and being discussed as corruption, as corrupt practices. There's plenty. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I assume that since you're writing about this, that the Hindu is sort of above this, paid news. So how does the Hindu remain financially competitive in this?
The Hindu is a family-owned newspaper. It's not a corporate paper. Secondly, but by the way, it's a very interesting question, because some newspapers which normally would not indulge in this practice told me that they did, because paid news sucked up all the advertising. The Mint newspaper, Live Mint, did a fantastic story showing in India advertising peaks at election time. Okay, advertising peaks at election time. Last election, advertising plummeted because everybody was into paid news. Right. So newspapers that didn't want to do it were forced to do it to stay afloat. The Hindu doesn't set itself corporate standards of profitability and therefore did not do it. And by the way, if we did it, there will be 200 newspapers to report on it immediately. Okay, we've alienated just about everybody.
Actually, I have a question.
Yeah.
Obviously there are foreign correspondents in India, right? The New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. Were they implicated in this at all?
Mm-hmm. After we wrote the stories in the Hindu, many of them did stories. There were more stories on paid news in the UK and US press than in India, because the Indian press was implicated. Okay? So that's a fact. In fact, Sunday Telegraph did this thing in February to check out on an institution called MediaNet, also on the net. You can check it. What you really need to look at is Times of India privatetreaties.com. But MediaNet sold them space. Yeah. So yeah, they were not. Oh yeah. Sorry, I apologize. In television, it could well have happened. We don't know. I mean, because some of the big television channels which are foreign owned did it, but we don't know the route. Not individual correspondence. No. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Well, I was wondering whether you think India is going to show America its future. That is, our media are going broke, and obviously Indian media are making a lot of money. So, is the message going to move?
Well, the two things. One is that we are locked onto the US as our role model. However, there's a reason why the Indian media are raking it in hand over fist,
Yes.
while your guys are broken.
Yeah.
The reason, one immediate and important reason, apart from the fact that I see no reason why I should go on buying newspapers, all of which say exactly the same thing, on Libya, on Iraq, on Afghanistan, on whatever. Apart from that fact of ceasing to buy from the sausage factory, there is also a very important factor of internet penetration. For all the wonderful boasting we do and bragging we do in India, broadband penetration is statistically negligible. 60% plus of Indian internet use consists of people going to cyber cafes to do email, their relatives in Dubai or Africa or wherever. So this huge shouting about how advanced we are, it reflects in a number of ways, but it does not reflect in broadband penetration. Broadband penetration is horrible. Okay? And you read newspapers on dial-up, that's very difficult. So the lack of broadband penetration and the rising literacy rates in India with each census, the rising literacy rates mean there are lots of people for whom there is a relatively cheap material available. The competition in India has meant, and corporate deep pockets have meant, that newspapers are selling at a fraction of their production cost. Okay. Now, in 2005, when Times of India was the only game in town, by the way, I'm a very faithful Times of India reader. The first paper I read in the morning, it makes my day every day. I was buying Times of India and Indian Express. Then 3 major newspapers came to town. The DNA, the Hindustan Times, all this stuff happened. when this happened, now I buy five newspapers a day for less than what I was paying for 2 in 2005. So they've got to make their money from something else. Okay, so the cover price of the newspaper has plummeted. There are Maharashtra Times to fight Lokmat in Maharashtra, Marathi language newspapers. They're offering you 6 months subscription for I think 20 rupees. Yeah, introductory offer, welcome offer. So the rising literacy rates means that people are looking for material to read or watch on television. Cheap newspaper is a good thing. It also gives them some information in terms of personnels and ads and things. Second is the lack of broadband penetration. And third is the sheer diversity in terms of language, region, where different things are happening in terms of literacy and culture and expansion. So we are doing much better. If we start seeing gigantic broadband penetration, we're going to see huge losses of profit. Yeah.
We have our own versions of paid news in this country.
Of course.
And one of
Where do you think we got it from?
Right. One of the biggest ones here is this huge industry of canned press releases and videos which enable the media outlet to save a lot of money on reporting and editing and shooting. So I'm wondering if that's taken off in India as well.
Oh yes, you do have all that, but let me point to you a much more direct form of paid content and paid news in the United States. When I started, I have great faith in one thing. Even when I'm looking at the devastation in agriculture, I go back to see what the US did because I know that that's what we did. We're very locked on to whatever you do. In 2000 or 2002, CBS, where is Barbara Walters' program, The View? Was it CBS? Yeah. CBS or ABC? ABC. Barbara Walters' The View. The executives of ABC, on record, on document, sold 8 episodes of The View to Campbell's Soup. And it was part of the agreement that the panelists would somehow work in the soup motif. And one of them might even say that old thing when we were all kids, Campbell's Soup. It actually happened. Okay? They sold 8 episodes to Campbell's Soup. Then comes 2005 and George W. Do you remember this huge scandal when the White House was forced to cancel the contracts of 43 columnists, including Maggie Gallagher and William Armstrong? Remember? Who were all being paid by the government to promote anti-abortion programs. The total expenditure of the government on public relations had gone up to $88 million. Armstrong had got about $250,000. Gallagher, I don't know, I think 40,000 or something. But 43 columnists were being on the payroll of the United. And what was astonishing is that many of the newspapers to whom they syndicated did not wind up their columns. Okay? You'd think that they ought to have been shafted and thrown out. Some of them continue to write in the papers that they were writing earlier. And, Armstrong was promoting the No Child Left Behind school program. And the White House was looking at No Columnist Left Behind programs. And 43, that's a big number, right? So let's give credit where it's deserved. Yes?
So speaking of schools, is there also an industry of paid school textbook content?
In India, what there is for schools, there's gigantic rivalry and jousting for contracts for textbooks. So your government comes to power, then you give the deal to one set of publishers. That's how it works. Okay, you have that. I come to power, and then a particular publishing house gets the contract or whatever for the schools, for that state's textbooks, and it just so happens that the publishing house owner is my brother-in-law. Pure coincidence, but yeah. Yeah.
I was wondering, how do you hope that the situation might change now that it has been exposed? You were saying that, even with a lot of exposure, some of the print media were just looking the other way or were not paying heed to any of the official legislation.
Two things. Already one, in immediate terms, there will be lots of changes. In the long run, nothing matters unless you are able to tame corporate power. Okay? You can't do that, you can't win. You can't quell corporate power, you can't win this battle. In immediate terms, the Election Commission of India, for instance, has taken excellent steps. I can't believe I'm praising an official institution. I've never done it in my life. They've taken very good steps, and it's become, in the Bihar Assembly elections, paid news came down considerably. Well, it's not, one shouldn't make too much of that, because in Bihar, in Bihar elections, it's not money power, it's muscle power that matters. But it did come down, and 87 people were pulled up for paid news, which meant that they had to include that paid news in their expenditure account. And it means that 87 guys have admitted that they practiced paid news. So at those levels, second, across the political spectrum, there was unanimity in Parliament in a discussion on paid news, where from the Communist Party of India, Marxist, to the Congress Minister for Information and Broadcasting were on the same page saying the same thing. 2 newspapers reported to Parliament debate. Nobody else carried a word, but it's there. Institutionally, the Press Council of India actually did that report. SEBI, the Securities Exchange Board, has put mandatory rules which, if someone goes to court, will be tested, because the SEBI has the power. So things can, in that sense, it's become a much more dangerous, it's become a little more difficult, let me say, to play the game. In the long run, if you can't de-link the media from large corporations, they will find other ways of doing it, and you lose. That's the bad part of it. Yeah.
One last question.
Shall I take 2 and 3 and finish it at one time? Okay.
The role of the government in shaping public opinion through the media, like what Chomsky and Herman would call manufacturing consent. So what has been the relationship in that direction?
Yeah.
Yeah, I just don't want to disappoint the people around here, and I would like to bring out this Lokpal bill thing and see in what way it might affect the dynamics of media, democracy, as well as corruption. Maybe, I think now I can hear the all.
You are an optimist, yes. Last.
What kind of sources can the common public trust in the midst of all this?
Lovely. Yeah. Let me begin with that last one. What kind of sources can the common public trust? By the way, all the data that I've given you, wherever I've mentioned numbers, figures, all of it is official Government of India data. One of the wonderful things about Indian democracy and why we are able to function is the complete anarchy of its structure. What one ministry classifies as top secret, the neighboring ministry publishes in its annual report. Okay. We leak like a factory of sieves. Right. So that's one of the plus points. Remember that the one attempt at authoritarian rule in India collapsed under its own weight after 19 months because nobody knew anything. That's how the emergency ended. Right. Somebody thought she was going to win an election. Right. So they went for the election. Now, another thing about India is there are hundreds and hundreds in the Indian languages and a few in English language of journals that attempt to give you alternate information. And I say this, thank you for raising it, I say this to absolutely every media audience that I speak to, every audience on media subjects that I speak to, which complain about the media, that if you are not, as a middle class professional or a middle class person, if you are not subscribing to and supporting at least 3 of those journals, you have no right to bellyache. Many of these journals are running on the money of their owner, on goodwill, on guys like us contributing free articles to them. but they are there to give you something. They give you value. So you can support these journals by subscribing to them. In the Indian languages, there are a very large number of small journals. In Maharashtra, all the small journals have carried special issues on paid news. Okay? There are many such journals. In the English language, many of the things that I'm saying, well, one, you can read the newspaper I write for because it will be there for you to read. I write about these things. Second is, in terms of journals, you can look at Frontline. It gives you very detailed information on the budget from a perspective that others don't. You can look and subscribe to a journal like Economic and Political Weekly. You're a university person, I suspect. But I'm saying, look at EPW is a very small journal. It's always struggling. But what value it gives you for money. And it is trust-owned. It is not corporate-owned. Very often I find myself in disagreement with EPW. But there is honesty and there's a trust, a commitment to give you something on the economics and politics of the country every week. So we could go on. I mean, there are many, many journals that do it, that keep the information out there for you, whether in the United States and its media, or in India and her media. Look, do you know the definition of the ultimate optimist, right? It's the guy who fell from the 50th floor of a building. Each floor he passed on the way down, he said, so far, so good. Yeah. Now, don't set yourself up for a disappointment. Let me be absolutely unambiguous. Is the Lokpal a good idea? Yes. Should there be a Lokpal? Yes. Should there be a Lokpal bill? Yes. Should the draft given to us now be the bill? Forget it. Okay? There is some really insane stuff in there. One, the collegium is to be made up of all Nobel laureates it has to include compulsorily all Nobel laureates of Indian origin, which includes V.S. Naipaul. And you know how much he loves India, right? Right. So, and recent Magsaysay Award winners, which includes me. That's the sheer arrogance of that. You know, one of the nice things is that the latest person of Indian origin to win a Nobel Prize, Venkat, said very disarmingly in some place where he was asked for some comment on education or politics, he said, I don't believe I'm competent to comment on other branches of chemistry. Okay. It's excessive humility, but it says something. Okay, then you please look at who they want in the collegium. In the entire huge distinguished list of the collegium, there is one elected representative. And that's the Speaker of the Lok Sabha, who votes in the Lok Sabha only when there is a tie. Okay? Now, there is an incredible arrogance in saying that the elected the people are worthless because they have elected bad people. Right? So, elected representative process is far less important than what we say is right. It's undemocratic, it's arbitrary. Corruption in your country has three major bases. One is in the structured inequality, caste, class, gender and regional factors that drive your society. Second is, and more recently, more decisively, in the last 20 years, economic policies that generate and deepen this inequality. And third, the culture of arbitrariness. That, I say we will give this to this firm in the Commonwealth Games and to the culture of arbitrariness. Now this precisely perpetuates the culture of arbitrariness. A few good men will decide what's right. By the way, it puts a deadly weapon in the hands of the government of India. Tomorrow, who's going to appoint civil society? I don't like your civil society, I'll get my own. As Groucho Marx famously said, these are my principles and I stand by them, and if you don't like them, I've got others. Right? So The government of India is already working on diffusing this. I have a great affection for Anna Sahib. I've known him. You know, he's a loose cannon, but he does some great things. Every now and then he pulls off something brilliant. He has a lot of respect. I have a lot of time for him. But that bill is, you know, as they say, you had to have a committee to turn out such garbage. So that's on the committee. The role of the media and government. Look, what do you do when the government is in print media? One of the great things in India was that government never owned print media. But what do you do when the chief minister of the state is the biggest media owner? I mean, Italy is grappling with that now, right? With a guy who's got 60% share of all media. What do? And paid news, Balaji, paid news is not about manufacturing content. It's first about manufacturing content. It's completely fabricated stuff, okay? Now, on Ashok Chavan's case, you know what was another thing remarkable about those 156 pages on the chief minister? They didn't mention the name of his rival. He fought an election against nobody. And he fought a powerful election because you had 156 pages in one newspaper. But no one knows the name of the rival. You see, if Ashok Chavan had not skimped a couple of $1 million, then they would have named the rival and trashed him. The rival was Dr. Madhav Kinalkar, the leading surgeon of Nanded district. And a former minister, but the media didn't mention his name once as the rival because you can't. He didn't pay for it. Right? So, the relationship of government to media is, there are still many tensions in that the media leadership now is the most aggressive on economic policies. The media ownership, corporate media ownership are far more aggressive on pushing neoliberal economic policies than anyone with half a brain would be in government of India. Okay? Because in government you have to deal with realities of the real world and you have to deal with the fact that people will go out and vote you out, and India has a decent record of doing that. Meanwhile, we are fixing that to see that people go out to vote for their favorite billionaire. Right? Because that is the juxtaposition. Government is increasingly a club of millionaires and billionaires. You know, one of the things, as I said, I dismissed the Chinese as being poor billionaires with just 2 billion. Let me deal briefly with the Russians. The Russians, I mean, every 5-10 years they send half their billionaires to prison. We send us to parliament. We're a civilized, mature democracy. Right? The best money can buy, as Greg Palast would say. Right? So there you are. You're seeing a gigantic enmeshing of the corporate world, of government and establishment and media. You're seeing this, you know, it's not a military industrial complex, though the military comes into it in terms of our nuclear establishment. Call it a military industrial informational media cultural complex. That's the emerging relationship. Thank you very much.